Hello, is this ISUPK?
Yeah, what's going on, brother?
Not much, man. I was seeing some videos, and I had a couple of questions that I'd like to ask. Um,
Alright.
so first of all, I don't know if y'all, because I've talked to different people and they've had different views. What are y'all's thoughts on the Apocrypha? Recently, I got a book on it, so I just wanted to know what y'all's thoughts were on the Apocrypha. Do y'all consider it canon, or is it some sort of a book of philosophy? What are y'all's takes on that?
Yeah, the Apocrypha is a part of the Old Testament. You know what I'm saying? We do believe it's canon. We do deal with the Apocrypha. One of the main reasons we deal with the Apocrypha is because when you read the New Testament
Mm-hmm.
about Yahweh Shai, you see that he celebrated the Feast of Dedication.
Mm-hmm.
And if you know anything about the Feast of Dedication, that originated in the book of Maccabees in the Apocrypha.
Mm-hmm.
So if Yahweh shall follow the Apocrypha, we should too.
So, if because a certain holiday is mentioned in the Apocrypha, that means that it's canon?
Yeah, because otherwise, how would he know about it? You understand? Like,
Mm-hmm.
that shows you he had the Apocrypha. You know
Okay.
what I'm saying?
Well, couldn't it also been like a tradition that the Jews had upheld, that the Israelites had upheld, like during the intertestamental period, even before the composition of the Apocrypha?
So then you have to show where that holiday originated
Right.
before the Apocrypha.
Well,
Which you won't find that you won't find that so-called holiday anywhere else but in the Apocrypha.
mm-hmm. Okay. So, what about people that were Israelites that did affirm and follow these holidays and practices, but would not affirm the Apocrypha as canon, that were Israelites that follow in one of the 12 tribes? Would you consider any of that testimony reliable or authentic, or something to consider?
Yeah, I would look into it. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
But you would have to show me. You have to show me an Israelite that does that,
Okay.
and then they would have to show me where that the tradition comes from.
Okay. So, are you familiar with the first century historian Josephus?
You said, am I familiar with that?
Mm-hmm. With Josephus.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the Josephus.
Do you believe that he was a Israelite? Because I've heard some people say he wasn't, and then one guy that I met and ran into said that he was after we went over trying to figure out who his father was.
Yeah, I would say Josephus was an Israelite. He wasn't necessarily in the truth, but yeah, he was an Israelite.
All right. In his work against Apion, he says that we do not possess myriads of inconsistent books conflicting with one another as the Greeks do, but our books, those which are justly believed, are only 22, referring to the Old Testament, and then goes on to say, of these 5 are the books of Moses. The prophets after Moses wrote the events of their own times in 13 books, and the remaining 4 books contain hymns to God and precepts for the conduct of human life, and which he says that these are the result of 22 books for the canon that he was talking about, and said this was even the canon that was laid up in the Jewish temple as holy and sacred.
Okay. And you using that to say, since he didn't claim the Apocrypha, we shouldn't.
Right, not just simply because of, like holidays and such, because I'm sure also in the Talmud it would make references to some of these practices and such, but I'm not sure if y'all, I'm just, speculating, y'all want to take the Talmud to be doctrinal or authoritative or canon in y'all's view, correct?
Right, because the Talmud conflicts with the Bible. When you deal with,
Mm-hmm.
like Josephus said, no book that we follow should conflict with the rest of the Bible. The thing about the Apocrypha is it doesn't conflict with the rest of the Bible. It actually meshes in, especially when you deal with the New Testament, about Paul's mission to the Greeks,
Mm-hmm.
to our people, Maccabees because the Greeks would kill us if we claimed to be Jews.
Mm-hmm.
At all. It was illegal for that. That explains who Paul was going to in the New Testament. So it doesn't go against the Bible. It actually helps the Bible's cause, which it's the Bible as well. I'm just speaking in terms so you can understand.
Okay.
But also, what I would say about that statement Josephus made, like we read Josephus for historic accounts, but we don't follow Josephus' faith. You understand? We follow
right.
Yahushua.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? So Josephus can say what he wants. You know what I'm saying? Like I said earlier, he wasn't the truth. He was an Israelite. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
That don't mean he had everything about the Lord, right? Though.
Right.
That don't mean that he was a priest. That don't mean that he was this. You know what I mean? It just meant that he was somebody there that we would reference for history
mm-hmm.
in that time.
Mm-hmm.
So since Yahushua, like I said earlier, since Yahushua dealt with the Feast of Dedication, I mean, can't really get around like where that came from in the Apocrypha. You know what I'm saying? It don't come from nowhere else. It originated during the Maccabees.
Mm-hmm.
And then you gotta ask yourself, when you deal with the West Indians, which is who we proclaim as the tribe of Benjamin,
mm-hmm.
it was illegal for them to read the Apocrypha, more specifically the Book of Maccabees. Why? Because it put a rebellion in them to where they would rebel against the so-called white man in slavery.
Mm-hmm.
You understand? Then they outlawed the book and made it illegal. You understand? So
yeah.
If it's the same thing like the Bible with the so-called American Negroes, with the Judites, they outlawing the Bible. We can't read it. I think we should see what's in it.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? I think we should deal with it.
Do you believe the guy that wrote First Maccabees was a prophet?
A prophet?
Mm-hmm.
I know he was a scribe. He had to been a scribe. A prophet? I don't know about a prophet, because prophets don't necessarily write the scriptures.
Right, but like
scribes write the scriptures.
right, but when the scribe in writing down what the prophet had said, since the people would have scribes write for them, like Jeremiah had Baruch write for him the epistle of Jeremiah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like so you asking them specifically about Maccabees, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Or
about First Maccabees.
First Maccabees?
Yeah.
That's a good question, because you don't really see too many prophecies in Maccabees. You know what I'm saying? It's really full of history.
Hmm.
So I would have to double check to see if there's any prophecies in the Book of Maccabees.
Well, wouldn't like the trying to think like I mean, you said the like feasts that are mentioned in the Apocrypha, especially in Maccabees, right?
The faiths?
Prophecies.
Yeah, prophecies. I don't recall like too many prophecies at all. You know what I'm saying?
Mm.
So I would have to double check to see if it is a prophetic book or if it's just a historic reference that gives you historic reference on that time.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really see prophecies in it.
Okay. So then how would we know if it was definitely inspired if it was not written by a prophet of God like most of the books of the Bible? But in this particular regard, it was instead written by what you called it just simply a scribe.
Right, the whole Bible was written by scribes.
Right, but when most of the words that come, that are being translated to the scribes come from the mouths of the prophets.
Yeah, but like I said, you didn't really deal with during that time. It's just like now.
Mm-hmm.
You're not really seeing prophecies. Like, okay, if somebody wanted to record this history that we're going through in America today,
Uh-huh.
that this history can't be recorded.
Right.
You understand? And not be valid.
Right.
Now, I ain't saying that there ain't no prophecies in Maccabees, like other prophecies will say, "Thus saith the Lord this, thus saith the Lord that." But there is accurate history in the Maccabees, and it adds up to what's going on right now. So it's not a prophecy as in this will happen in the future, but the history definitely is prophetic.
I see.
For example, how when the scripture said when Alexander the so-called great got into power, wickedness multiplied in the earth, showing you white supremacy. That was the first time white supremacy had started to dominate in the earth. You got other scriptures in Maccabees that say that the Greeks wanted everybody to be one culture. Forget your own culture. We should all be one culture and all get along and mesh our cultures.
Right.
Which is what America does now. You know what I'm saying? So
yeah.
I don't see anything in Maccabees that goes against the rest of the Bible for it to even be a problem. You know what I'm saying? If anything, it's helping us for right now.
Okay.
The same way it helped those brothers in the West Indian Islands, like I said before, rebel against the white man.
Well, would you mind me if I read from First Maccabees and you give me your thoughts on this, how to understand this?
Yeah.
So this is First Maccabees chapter 4, verse 46, and it says, "And laid up the stones," actually going to verse 45, says, "They thought it best to pull it down, lest it should be a reproach to them, because the heathen had defiled it. Wherefore they pulled it down, and laid up the stones in the mountain of the temple in a convenient place, until there should come a prophet to show what should be done with them." So, based on what was written there, it seems to indicate that during the time there was no prophet. They were waiting for for some sort of prophet to show up. When it wrote First Maccabees 4, verse 46. So, would you say that as it's saying that there's not a prophet there at that point, or?
Yeah, at that time that it was written right then. Yeah, it wasn't a prophet right then and there.
Okay. Another thing, this is going to the second Maccabees, and I guess this will be my last question about it, dealing with Maccabees, is in second Maccabees chapter 15, in verses 38 and 39. It mentions the books, and this is towards the end of it, it mentions the books, what it basically qualifies it down as its shortcomings. In verse 38 and 39, the last verses of second Maccabees, it says, "And if I have done well, and as is fitting to the story."
Were you reading wrong?
Second Maccabees chapter 15, verses 38 through 39.
Alright, go ahead.
"And if I have done well, and as is fitting the story, it is that which I desired, but if slenderly and meanly, it is that which I could attain unto. For as it is hurtful to drink wine or water alone, and as wine mingled with water is pleasant and delighteth the taste, even so speech finely framed delighteth the ears of them that read the story, and here shall be an end." So, he seems to be describing, especially around verse 38, "If I have done well, and as is fitting the story, it is that which I desired, but if slenderly and meanly, it is that which I could attain unto." It sounds like he's basically saying that, he hopes that with the book that he's written, that it doesn't contain errors, but he's not so sure of that.
Okay, so what's your overall point?
Well, my point is just simply a question, like how would you reconcile or understand these verses? What's your perspective on that?
With these two verses right here?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I haven't read Maccabees in a while, to be honest with you. I would have to like double check. I would have to go back and look over it again. You know what I'm saying? Because I haven't read Maccabees in a while.
Okay.
So I don't just want to give you something off the top of my head. You know what I mean?
Oh, that's understandable. Before I go to one last question I got, I would recommend, in case you want to get some that helps with the studying of the Apocrypha, is the same book that I got. It's called An Introduction to the Apocrypha by David Da Silva. It's like 400 pages of a in-depth study on the Apocrypha, in case you ever want to take a look at it sometime in the future.
Okay, so like, so you saying like these two verses means we should throw the whole Apocrypha away?
Well, not the whole Apocrypha, because these are only dealing with specifically the time of the Maccabean revolt at that particular time period. So this would just be dealing with mostly 1st, 2nd Maccabees. I think that there's more reasons to the Apocrypha, because in Romans 3, verse 2, Paul says that, the Jews in general were entrusted and given trust to hold on to the oracles of God. And when they're entrusted with it, that means they are to take care of it. So they were left to be responsible and in charge of the Old Testament canon. And with Josephus, with, though I'm not sure you would consider this a good example, Philo, and then, of course, there's even the Council of Jamnia, which was a Jewish council that discussed the issue about the Old Testament canon that had been historically known, which seems to lack the Apocrypha, so that throughout the history of the Jewish people and the historical people, they didn't view the Apocrypha as canon. And I think there's even a passage within the Apocrypha itself that doesn't refer to itself as canon, but rather it lays out the threefold canon as the Moses, or the law, the prophets, and then the wisdom literature. So it gives this sort of threefold division, and I think from the Apocrypha itself, from the Jews themselves, that these two sources would indicate, especially based on the testimony of Romans 3:2, that we should, not consider the Apocrypha as scripture, but consider it as beneficial for wisdom in certain areas, as well as learning of history, say in the case of Maccabees with the Maccabean revolt and the holiday of Hanukkah.
Right. So and when you say Jewish tradition, you mean us or the people who call themselves Jews now?
Well, I'm just talking about, like, when I talk about Jewish tradition, I'm talking about like the Israelites from back then, especially during the time of Jesus' day, to the early sources within the BC area. So, which would include like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, all of these people. That's what I would go by when referring to tradition, is something that's not just what is in written material, but also that the written material has origins in places outside. Like, while Job is not the first written story in the Bible, it is the first story that really is passed down from the oral tradition that was focused on in the Israelite history.
Right.
So that's what I would refer to by the Jewish tradition.
But yeah, I definitely agree with you when the Apocrypha is not all prophetic.
Mm-hmm.
Like for example, the book of Ecclesiastes is not in the Old Testament. It's not really prophetic. It's just wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
That certain book, the Apocrypha, is, you know what I'm saying, the same way. Ecclesiasticus,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of its history, a lot of the prophecy comes from Ezra, first and second Ezra. You know what I'm saying? So, but yeah, I mean, we still deal with it. You know what I mean? All of it ain't. Some of it is just history and wisdom. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. And some of it is prophecy.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like, you know what I mean? I ain't really
All right. So the one last question before I gotta shower for work. Romans, chapter 3. Hmm.
No, I'm listening. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Thought you were saying some. Romans chapter 3, verse 31. You would say that means, do we then make void the law through faith? God forbid. Yea, we establish the law, meaning that's basically that we are to keep and uphold the law, because we're not making void the law. We're establishing the law. Correct?
Yeah, that's what it says. We establish the law.
Okay. And that would mean the law in total, right?
Everything except the punishments.
Except the punishments?
Right.
Like, what do you mean by that?
Okay. Go to I can just stay in the same chapter.
Mm-hmm.
Let me see real quick. One second, brother. Hold on 1 second. All right.
Sure thing.
Go to Galatians 3 and 11.
All right. Galatians 3 and 11.
And hold that one you just pulled in Romans 2.
Mm-hmm. All right. So I'm at Galatians 3.
3 and 11.
3:11.
So it says, but that no man is justified by the law in the sight of God is evident, for the just shall live by faith.
Mm-hmm.
You understand? The same thing that Romans says. So now, since we live by faith, should we make void the law?
Mm-hmm.
And it says, no, we establish the law. So now, what's the difference between this law that we're not justified in Galatians and the one that we establish in Romans, the 3rd chapter?
Say again.
In this scripture, in Galatians 3 and 11,
Uh-huh.
what's the difference from this law that we're not justified by than the one in Romans where it says we establish that law? In this one it says we're not justified by the law.
Mm-hmm.
In Romans it says establish the law.
Right.
So what's the difference between the two? Because if there isn't a difference, then it's a contradiction.
Well, I mean, I don't see the difference, but I wouldn't see the contradiction there either. Because
So then, what does it mean by we're not justified by the law? And then, on the other hand, it says we establish the law. Why should we establish the law if we're not even justified by it?
well, I would say for the establishing of the law is that the law, meaning the Torah, the entire 5 books of Moses in general, not just simply the laws that are within it, but the entirety of it within what we see there, is useful for understanding the history as well as even the prophecies of Christ himself that we can see within the laws. Because in Romans 3, while it says in verse 31 that, that law, we establish it, it then says in verse 28 the same thing with what we read in Galatians 3:11, which says, therefore we conclude that a man is justified by faith without the deeds of the law. So,
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So, how could Paul on one hand say, how could Paul on one hand say we're not justified by the deeds of the law,
Mm-hmm.
then turn around and say we establish the law?
Right, and that's what I'm saying is that he's saying that, because people who think, there were some people back then that would think, that because they're justified by faith apart from the works of the law, then that means there's no more use for it. But Paul is rebuking these people and saying, just because that, you're not justified by faith, or you're justified by faith apart from the works of the law, does that then mean that the law is just completely meaningless and useless? No, but that means we're establishing the law, and that the law, by reading the law, meaning the Torah, it points to Christ. And this is what we read in Colossians, in which it talks about, the feasts and the holy days and the Sabbaths, that these are a shadow of the things to come, that all of these, if you focus on the festivals, they prophesy actually and point to Christ, the coming and the fulfillment of the Messiah himself that is founded even within these laws. So therefore we shouldn't just simply make it a New Testament only for the canon, but that's why there is a 66 book canon, because it must include these for us to see why Christ comes into the picture and why he's so significant as the Messiah, as the Savior.
So do we keep the law, or do we not keep the law?
For salvation, no. As far as keeping the law, if that's someone's own personal thing, there are some people I know that do keep the law, not for salvation, but for the benefit of their own selves. And they're able to, or Paul even grants this in Romans 14 when dealing with people that are struggling with the diet issues. There's one person who doesn't want to follow along. He's eating the dietary laws as well as the meats, but then one person's only following the dietary laws, and that it's a sin for one to try to tempt the other to break their own convictions, especially for the case of the person trying to get the person to break the other's vows that he's taken of participating in the laws. So like, if, for example, like if you were to come over to my house and I was eating shrimp, I was serving up shrimp, and that's against the dietary laws, correct?
Right.
And so if you come over and I found out that that you weren't to eat that, and that the sight of it would be sort of a temptation or sort of a disavowing to you, the right thing for me to do that would not cause you to stumble, which Paul says is what it regards it as, is to set a stumbling block, to do something like that, I would just have to say then, you know what, I'm gonna lay off the shrimp for today. Let's go eat wherever you want or what you want. You know what I'm saying?
When you say Paul said that, where are you getting this from?
This is Romans 14.
Okay.
We're talking about someone who is weak in the faith.
Right. Let's go to Romans 14.
Okay.
Let's read what you're talking about.
Sure. It starts at the very first verse.
Go ahead.
Him that is weak in the faith receive ye, but not to doubtful disputations. For one believeth that he may eat all things, another who is weak eateth herbs. Let not him that eateth despise him that eateth not, and let not him which eateth not judge him that eateth, for God has received him.
Hold on, let me stop you.
Sure.
In verse 2.
Mm-hmm.
In verse 2, when Paul says, for one believeth that he may eat all things, what's the all thing?
Well,
what's the according to verse 2?
Well, the all things is referring to that which is the common and the unclean. So this would be someone that's, eating as well as the stuff that's in the dietary laws, also the things like the shrimp and such. So not just the herbs and such, but also there.
When it says all things, does that mean I can eat a human being?
Human being? No, this is simply within the context of just simply like addressing, because he's specifically in Romans, he's addressing the whole debacle and debate that's been going on between the Judaizers and the newcomer Gentiles in these certain areas, specifically in Rome.
Yeah, but the issue ain't okay. What you saying is this is not an issue on eating or being able to eat unlawful food and lawful food. That's not the issue. The issue is all things, meaning what's everything that's lawful. Herbs, meat, whatever meat that's lawful, lamb, beef, read Paul say establish the law.
Right.
Which I wanted to refer back to. The differences between the law is when he says that we're not justified by the deeds of the law, he's talking about the punishments of the law. That's why I said earlier, when you asked, do we follow the law in its entirety, I said everything except for the punishments. Because we're not justified by the deeds of the law, meaning the punishment. You understand? That's why he didn't turn around and said we established the law.
Okay.
Meaning we establish thou shalt not kill. We established the dietary law. We established whatever other law you can think of. You understand it? The punishments are done away with. But now, because we're under grace. You understand? Which is why in Jeremiah 31 and 31 it says, I'm going to write the law in your inward part. Meaning the law is going to be something to where it's kept by faith. You're not going to need, because back then, if you didn't keep the law, a priest kicked down your door, and you had to pay for whatever punishment he had coming to you, whether it was death or sacrifice and paying the fine. You understand?
Yeah.
Now we keep the laws written in our inward parts. So we keep the law by faith. We don't need a punishment to help us keep the law, because that didn't work in the first place. You understand?
Yeah.
So that's what Paul, when he said, don't the deeds of the law, we're not justified by that. We established the law. You understand? That's the deal with it. In Romans, it's not talking about they're not arguing about being able to eat shrimp and whatever the case, because if I can eat shrimp, then I can eat a cat, I can eat a squirrel, I can eat a mouse, I can eat another person, because that's all things. If you want to look at it in a literal sense of all things, I'm not talking about all things in a literal every single thing sense. It's talking about all things that we were already allowed to eat. Nowhere did Paul ever say, or Christ ever say, that we don't have to keep the dietary law.
So there's no... Okay. Well, I think there is actually a passage that does refer to that, and especially go into the original language that emphasizes that point.
Matter of fact, let me help you out real fast.
All right.
Go to 1 Timothy, I believe it's 4.
1 Timothy 4.
4 and 3.
4:3. Okay. It's forbidden to marry, not commanding to, and commanding to abstain from meats which God hath created to be received with thanksgiving of them which believe and know the truth.
So now, Paul, when he said all things, he was talking about meats which God hath created to be received with thanksgiving of them which believe and know the truth. Which meats did God create to be received with thanksgiving?
Which meats did God create for Thanksgiving? I think you mentioned lamb as one of them.
According to the dietary law. You understand? So that was the issue. The issue was some were commanded to abstain from meats that was lawful to eat, and then there were other people who didn't eat meat at all. They were what you would call vegan or vegetarian, which is what this argument is relevant now. Some Israelites, don't. They think that eating meat is unlawful. Some Israelites, we eat all things, meaning going by the dietary law, though.
Okay. So.
Now, what were you gonna take?
Oh yeah, it was in Mark chapter 7.
Mark chapter 7. This is when I'm familiar with this. Mark 7 and what?
let's go into starting from verse 20 is where he starts speaking, and of which he says, quote, that which cometh out of the man, that defileth the man, for the man, or from within, out of the heart of man, proceeds evil thoughts, adulteries, fornications, murders, theft, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lavishness, an evil eye, blasphemy, pride, and foolishness. To which then he says, all these things from within, or come from within, defile the man. And earlier he was talking about that in dealing with the issue of the washing in the hands of the food, that would then, the food enter, people say that that's defiling. But Jesus says in verse 19, because it entereth, that it cannot defile him, because it entereth not into his heart, but into the belly, and goeth out into the draught, purging all the meats. And so.
So the issue, even here, the issue isn't the issue was never about unclean foods. They wasn't sitting down eating unclean food. The issue was them not following the tradition of washing up before you eat.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I said it's not about. That's why he said it's not about what goes into you. You understand? You're gonna eat it whether your hand is dirty, clean. It's about your actions, what you do on the outside, which the Pharisees that were accusing Christ was not keeping none of the laws. You understand? So that's why he cut him with that.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't sitting down getting ready to eat a plate of catfish or shrimp or nothing like that, or pork. That wasn't the scribes and Pharisees' issue. That issue was him not washing before he ate.
Mm-hmm. So he wasn't declaring all foods clean?
No, because he wasn't sitting down eating unclean food.
Okay. Well, right, that could be the case, that he wasn't sitting down eating unclean food. But what about the text that's there that does say, and it's in verse 19, in the original language, in which it says,
right,
which says katharzon panta ta bromata, purifying all the foods, which means in English to declare all foods clean.
Right. What is it being purified from, though?
What is it being purified from?
Yeah, the whole issue is it's not the food itself that's being purified. It's the fact that he didn't wash his hands. The food is purified. You understand what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
It's not the food that he's eating. It's not the food that he's eating. It's the fact that he didn't wash his hands, which is why the scribes and the Pharisees would look at that food as unclean now.
Mm-hmm.
Because he didn't wash his hands first.
So if we wash our hands, that would make a food clean?
According to the scribes and Pharisees, yes.
But what about the Bible?
The whole issue. It wasn't about eating unclean food in the sense of food not being according to the dietary law.
Mm-hmm.
The food was defiled because, according to the scribes and Pharisees, the food was defiled because he didn't wash first, which was a tradition, not a law that you have to wash your hands before you eat. Israelites are just a clean people. When you read Leviticus, the 15th chapter, it talks about all the hygienic laws, how you would have to wash after sex and stay unclean, and if you're on your period, this, that, and the other. It was always our tradition, which is also where baptism comes from. It was always our tradition to wash. And over time, we began to look at washing as something spiritual when it was just hygienic. You understand?
Yeah.
So that issue wasn't like the food wasn't defiled because it was unlawful. It was defiled because he didn't wash first. That's why Yahweh replied to them, "It's not what goes into you." Meaning, it's not about this so-called dirty food that I touch with my dirty hands. It's not about it going
Mm-hmm.
But unclean food is not mentioned here at all.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for that. I gotta get going now, but this was very informative. So thank you for your help, man, and have a God bless day.